Good morning. My name is Egor, and I have kind of really complicated family name, so if I can pronounce it, but you probably won't anyway. So I work for Vocus Communications New Zealand and former N2 and previously Core Plus as well. And I run a team of a networks team or DevOps team in there. So here we're going to talk about the network automation with Ansible and what goes beyond Ansible as well. Well, the first one is why would you want to automate at all? So for me and for a lot of people, I think as well that we're going to talk about the consistency of the configuration and to increase the deployment speed and to reduce troubleshooting time, and for just they all sound like a good reasons to me. So the first one is consistency. So that what will include is just reduce typos. So often you make mistakes, like you're typing that or you're pasting in the giant QoS config or something like that, and that takes time. And sometimes people make mistakes and they do typos as well. The automation in Ansible probably will allow you to use templates. So you can have a templated configuration file so you don't make any typos in the variables or like your polices in the values of these polices in there. You can just get from the variables which you put in different places. And you can introduce the sanity checks, so you can just have a dry runs of the templates. So you just basically run Ansible and runs playbook. And after it doesn't really do anything. It just outputs the diff between the current configuration and the what's intended to be the configuration. So you can look at those as well, and you can make a decision whether the config is consistent to your templates. So the second one is the deployment speed, right? So currently, a lot of networks are undergoing a lot of changes, and you probably want to deploy more and more routers in various places. So probably going to be a good idea to use Ansible for that as well. So if you have a set of predefined templates, you can roll out those routers very quickly. There are modules inside of Ansible which you can use to automate it as well. So you just take the router out of the box, connect it to the terminal, and you can connect. You can configure it over terminal using your templates as well. Troubleshooting time. So reduce the troubleshooting time. We can run Ansible and we can log into multiple hosts at the same time, issuing some commands or doing some other checks which you wanted to do. And by doing that, you can see what's actually going on from different perspectives. You can, yeah. So that's about the term. So why Ansible? Why Ansible and not the others? The Ansible is agentless, so it doesn't require any agents to be present on the on your boxes, which is in a lot of cases almost impossible to do. Great vendor support, supports a lot of vendors, and simple. Well, relatively simple, but compared to the other things which can do automation, relatively simple, and arguably most widely adopted as well. A lot of support from the community. You can have some support from one of the communities which is on Slack. It's called Network to Code, and you can join that one, and there's a lot of help in there, as well as on GitHub and other places possibly. There's a list of supported vendors. There's quite a lot. All the major vendors are supported, different levels of support though. For example, for Juniper Junos and for Nokia or for Alcatel, and for some Cisco XRs and iOS XRs, and it's more like there's more support available, so you can roll back configuration, you can commit lock unlock configurations and things like that. So that's for vendors. So you have some alternatives to it. So there's a Puppet, Salt, Chef, Napalm, and there's also option to build your own. We're going to talk about that. Napalm. And Napalm is just a library, like a Python library, which interacts with your devices. It's not really a complete solution, so you need to write your own. So you're going to be writing Python and using that library, and you're going to just basically interact with your devices using these libraries. Supported vendors for Napalm. You can see quite a lot of them supported. So in some cases, I think Fortinet is supported by Napalm, but not supported by Ansible. But Ansible has a module for Napalm as well, so you can use it. Puppet agent, I think, runs on different operating systems included in Junos, and I think you can have some support on Cisco as well. So it's installed inside of the operating system, and you can basically you can just use that as well to install configuration and change that. But the support is very limited, so in some cases you can just change VLANs and do that kind of thing. So Chef, don't know much about that. Try to find some information about that to have a look what's going on with that and like how many people are using it. Seems like not many people are using Chef, so don't know. Salt, there are some various people using it. I think Cloudflare are using it to orchestrate the whole network. But by network, I mean I think the systems people are using it as well as the networking guys. That was the choice for us to use Ansible as well because our systems guys are using Ansible. So build your own. You can always build your own using. Currently, there are APIs available like netconf or restconf. You can use those to actually programmatically control your devices, or more programmatically control your configuration of your devices. So you can reconfigure, you can apply the config, remove the config, roll back configurations, just see the diff of the configurations which you're gonna apply. There are some commercial offerings as well. The commercial offerings include TLF and Glueware probably. It's really hard to decipher their website and what they do, but I heard they kind of do the same thing as well. So where do I start? Where would you start if you wanted to start using Ansible? So Windows is not supported as a control machine, but Linux FreeBSD and macOS are supported. So you can just install Ansible by cloning the GitHub Git repo or via your OS package manager. How it works? Ansible has the main thing is playbooks. You can manage configurations of your network devices using the playbooks. Playbooks are YAML syntax. So in the language which they use inside is intentionally trying not to be a programming language. So therefore they actually have kind of loops there, but it's actually not a programming language. You also need a host file where you just have a list of all of your hosts you're going to manage, and you have additionally per group or per host variable files as well, where you can store per group or per host variables. So that's a playbook example. So you can see, just the name of it, and then the host is going to apply. You can mix and match, and you can do all sorts of different stuff with the host. So you can gather facts about device as well, but in networking, it's hardly ever used because of the networking module itself is going to do it, not the actual Ansible playbook. So there's models for variables to prompt you for variables. Currently, it's just a simple playbook which I just wrote for the sake of that presentation to show you how to do it simpler way. So you can just use the username and password, and you can just enter it, and it will prompt you for a password, and use those variables further down. So if you can see at the bottom of that, there's a Junos install module, which is user and you use an username, and the curly braces, they are variables which are going to be picked up from the prompt. So, and also there is a diff file. So currently in that playbook I'm using Junos module, so it will output the diff files into that directory, and will name every single file for every single device as the name of the device. So that's that. The host file, that's quite simple. You just have the list of the host names in there. And host variables files, that's how you store variables and their values in there. So you can just have the variables there, and you can just use that. So the Ansible, when it runs, the Ansible will use a host name, and there's a directory structure which I'll explain after it. It will pick up all the variables from the files which are stored in specific host host variable directory. So we'll try to match the host name against those file names, and after that we'll pick up all the variables from those files. Same goes for the group files as well. So here's a directory structure. So there's this directory structure is from best practices of Ansible. So I do encourage you to use that because it simplifies a lot of things if you do it that way. Templates. Ansible uses Jinja 2 as its templating engine. So if you don't know what templating engine is, it basically allows you to manipulate text files or HTML in some cases, which is probably text as well. So you can Ansible uses Jinja Python Python templating engine underneath. So basically, when you're going to be writing your configuration and your templates, you're going to be using Jinja 2 templating engine to actually do it. And you're going to be using templating module, which is actually going to write those template files. So that's how a template look. This is an example of Juno's configuration. So basically, you can just well, I think it's is it eaten? Yeah, it's a bit cut off from the left side, I guess, but you can see the commands. So basically, you supply the set of just a whole config in set commands, and you can see there are conditions in there, so you can use conditionals in the templating engine, and you can, based on the conditions, you can include other files as well. So here in the example, I'm using, depending on the access group, I'm just changing the config, so some of the people who are in, for example, would be in provisioning team can have access to the peer routers, for example. So run. And that's how you run it. It's just a picture of me running that. So you just say run Ansible playbook, and then you specify your inventory file, and that's how you run it. And you specify the playbook, and that's what happens. It verifies netconf connectivity in my case. So actually underneath, if you're using Juniper module, it will use netconf to connect to the devices and to apply the config and roll back the config and all of that. So I will first we're just verifying the connectivity by just connecting TCP port 830 and generating configuration files, installing configuration files. That's a basic kind of scenario of how you would use Ansible to do basic stuff. There are more complicated examples, and if you want to talk to me, you can talk after it. Going further, so Ansible itself does not really provide any deployment strategy, so it's up to you how you're going to do it. So I would encourage you to limit the damage. Do not run the whole thing at the same time. You can, where you specify hosts in the playbook, you can specify all and run it. I would think about that to do. I would think before you would do it. So limit the damage and start applying changes on a single host, and after it verify the changes. You can do it with different tasks within one playbook and apply changes on 2 devices in different parts of your network and move on to 3, 5, 8, sort of in Fibonacci sequence. Use loops in your playbook to achieve this, so you can specify the hosts, so you can have an options which is with items, and you can specify items which are going to be your host names. And you can use a step flag when you're running that as well. So you can say, I'm running onto the first 2 devices, then I stop, and then it waits for your input if you want to go further than that. And it's the next step, and you go further than again. Use dynamic inventory. You probably don't want to, like, if you have many hosts, like we do, so you probably don't want to use flat files to store your variables. It's going to be impossible to manage at some stage. You're going to have like 10,000 different files with 10,000 different hosts and stuff, so that's not going to scale well. You probably want to have some inventory database where you store the files. So at that point, you probably want to start thinking about that. Ansible has a API in a way, so you can feed that JSON, specific JSON object on standard input, and I can use this from standard input, and from that JSON I can get variables in and can use it inside of the playbook, so anywhere. The format is defined. There's a documentation for Ansible on the website, so I'll talk about documentation later. So you can actually ingest the JSON with all of your host variables and group variables at one go, and that's what happens, and that's how I do it. Version control, use version control. So all of that directory structure, which I was talking previously about, it's all. It would be better if you use version control for it. So you always use Git or something. Well, you can use SVN as well, but I prefer Git. So you can store it in the. You can actually revert back. You can have branches, or you can work together if you have a big team. Like if more than one engineer works on that. Beyond Ansible, so there will be some circumstances where you cannot use Ansible, or it's just going to be too hard to use Ansible alone. You can things like job scheduling, case where you need GUI, automatic fault detection and remediation as well. So those kind of things will be hard to achieve with Ansible. So you would probably need to do something else. You probably want to use some APIs. There are a couple different options available, which is netconf, restconf, gRPC, and SNMP. Everyone knows SNMP, I guess. They can be used as an API into network devices. You can interact with devices, you can apply the configuration. All of these APIs, or at least majority of them, provide you access to the management plane, so you can actually change the configuration. So netconf. Netconf allows you to manipulate the configuration, and it will return it depends on vendor support, but for example in Junos and in Cisco nowadays, it will, if you execute some sort of short commands, it's actually an RPC call. It's an RPC call to a device. It will return the information you get with the short command, but in well-formed XML. So you can use libraries and your Python scripts or your any favorite language to actually get the structured data just straight away. So that's called marshalling and marshalling. So you can use those libraries to actually get the information. So you don't need to parse anything like you would normally with the CLI. That's how netconf looks like. The first one is request to the device. So you send an RPC request. For example, in this case, we're requesting FPC information from a Juniper device, and it will reply with the FPC information. And that's the reply you can see. So that's pretty much how that looks on the netconf side. RESTconf, it's not really a standard yet per se. It just provides the mappings of the YAML modules to the RESTful interface. So actually, it just works like any other API. If you're familiar with some of these APIs, you can just get or post into the device, and it will reply with a JSON. It's not so widely available yet as netconf. Netconf has more support than RESTconf, but I think major vendors like Cisco, Juniper, and Alcatel, maybe Arista, they support that. That's how it looks. You can just use curl in this case to actually get, and it will reply with JSON. So that's what you can see. gRPC, it's not really a standard. It's an RPC framework, so you can use the. So the benefits of that is actually you get definitions of that RPC with that API. So what you can do, you can generate your code. So you can actually run the generator. It will generate the code, and you can use it in your file. So you need to define the structures. They're already defined for you. There's some support available for Cisco IIS XR and Juniper Junos, so you can install config. You can remove config rollback with using gRPC on Cisco. On Junos, they're using gRPC for streaming telemetry, which I'm going to talk about as well. So these are actually an example of protocol buffer files from Cisco. So that actually has a definition of some service in these config operations, and the object is going to return. It's just an example. It's just partial example from the protofile definitions, but you can actually use it. It's going to be more extensive if you go to a Cisco GitHub account. You can find the examples of that as well. So you can generate for you object definitions for your favorite language from that. There are plenty available. All the main languages are available, so you can generate. So there is some development nowadays for control plane APIs as well, so which will allow you to interact with the control plane directly, not actually talking to the management plane. So for example, in Junos currently you can manage the BGP neighbors and the BGP neighbors with that. So and you can use firewall rules as well, so you can interact with firewalls directly. No need to apply the configuration. That can be handy when you need something to be done immediately. Like, for example, in situations like you want to test something, or there are some scenarios where the bandwidth changes. So, for example, if you one of the examples I was thinking about is that, for example, you have the satellite scenario where you actually have a different when you have a different signal and the level of signal changes and the modulation changes. So you can track that from the external software, so you can get it from the terminal, from the satellite terminal, and you can change your QoS policies accordingly on the fly. That's one of the examples which you could use it. So this is much faster than in doing a change in the configuration. Not to say it's immediate, but for example, if you change in configuration on the big device, it will take you a minute. That thing will take you 5 seconds to change. So that's kind of works like that. So use cases for the APIs are going to be something which needs a GUI. So you can provisioning, for example, you wouldn't probably want to use Ansible for provisioning. You would want to write you want to have some kind of portal where you can have provisioning. Your provisioning guys can go in there, and it's going to be probably a web interface. You go in and you configure your L2 or L3 VPNs. Ansible is good for something smaller, or for something which is your network engineers do. So, for example, if you're configuring a lot of LSPs and traffic engineering parts and those kind of things, that's the good thing to start with. So, and for automatic fault finding and remediation as well, so you can write your own scripts or your own software to actually do it. And for that one, you're probably going to use something like netconf, so you can query the data in well-formed XML, look at some conditions which you apply some logic to it, and after it you can change the configuration accordingly, or you can do something else with it, or you just can alarm on it, but maybe make an alarm more meaningful. So you can say the link is down because the light levels are low on that link, and you can go further with that as well. So the other part of it is streaming telemetry. So if you want to do automatic remediation and auto remediation, you probably want to have some telemetry because you want to have a feedback loop. What's going to happen if you can stream the interface, all the counters from CPU counters, you can stream the interface counters and many others as well. And you can use that information, you can fit it into time series database, and after it you can use some different software, which is currently, there's a couple alternatives in the open source alternatives. You can actually use that to automatically detect the anomalies in your time series data, and you can trigger an action for it. So if you're, for example, if you bandwidth, if you have packet drops on the interface, you can start triggering the remediation software, which will go and try to have a look and try to perform some operation to find out why it's doing that. So I think currently supported on Arista, Cisco, and Juniper. So Juniper supports streaming telemetry via gRPC. So you can subscribe to, it's a subscription model, so you can subscribe to telemetry and it will send you a lot of details. So you can actually store data into a time series database. And I'm not really familiar with Arista and Cisco. I know Arista is doing much more in that space than anyone else. But software for if you want to store that data, so probably there are a couple open source alternatives. So it's OpenTCSB and InfluxDB. So I'm personally using InfluxDB for now, but I'm looking at the OpenTSDB as well for anomaly detection and alerting. The capacitor is used. It's open source software. It's written by the same people as Influx. You can do all sorts of things with that, as well as you can call within that. You can call the external script, so you can analyze data, and there's all sorts of analysis available within the capacitor, so you can do that. So basically how it works, in FluxDB itself has a subscription API, so you can subscribe to the data points. It will collect data points over time, calculate something, and make a decision whether it's within the limits or outside. So you can do some graphing, alerting, as people were talking on Grafana. Grafana is great. It's the next evolution after Cacti, which have been around for a long time. We probably need to stop using it, and there's new tools which you can use. Grafana recently added alerting as well, so you can, in any graph, you can add the alerts, and it will send alerts to Slack, PagerDuty, and maybe emails as well. So that's pretty much how it works. If you ask me if it's in production, it is in production, some of it, and we're using ANSIBLE extensively. So that's any questions?
Have you looked at the NetMiko library as well?
Yeah, the interesting thing, so most of my programming is done in Go, so I'm not a Python programmer at all, so NetMiko is more like a Python library, but I know a lot of people are using it in the community, so I have no problem with that.
Do you have any recommendation how to handle or manage passwords? Because in one of your templates you have like super secret for one of the devices, but you don't want to.
Yeah, there is a module inside of Ansible which is called Vault. I think you can use that to store passwords, or you can one time, you can have a time frame where you can say you're going to store my password for the day, or until I close my PC and until I log out. So you can sort of, if you're familiar with GitHub and the GitHub client, it can cache password, so you can actually use the same thing inside of Ansible as well. Or you can just alternatively, currently on a lot of software, you can just use keys for authentication. So you can just use keys, and you don't need to do that. So you can just auth with keys.
Since you're using GitHub Since you're using GitHub for your version control, are you doing any kind of linting or unit tests or integration tests when you do a commit or anything like that?
I know it's possible, so you can definitely perform it. Yeah, there's currently for at least Juniper and Cisco, maybe other ones as well, there's young modules available, so you can definitely do it. So you can probably, well, you need to write a lot of software though, but it's definitely possible. So what you can do, you can just apply standard CI/CD, so continuous integration, continuous delivery practices to it. So you can basically, because the config has a model, the model is provided you in YARN files, so you can generate the whole config, and after it, when you apply in the config, you can, even before it goes into the device, you can compare those two, and if there are any differences or inconsistencies, it just doesn't pass the build state, so that will not be deployed as well. But I guess it's going to be a different paradigm to what Ansible does. So it's like currently, I know some people are using Jenkins for actual network development. So how they would do it is they have a GitHub repo. So you commit to the GitHub repo, and you commit to, and it goes to your own branch possibly, or to the main branch, or I don't know how actually they manage that situation, but it doesn't matter which branch it goes to. It goes to the branch, and after it, the automated system passes the CI/CD checks, and if it passes builds, it goes into the other software, which will go and deploy the config automatically. So basically, everything is done in your IDE or your editor or anything like that. So that's one of the ways to do it. But it requires a lot of mindset change within the networking team, right? So networking guys are often not the programmers, as same as me. So my university degree is kind of in programming space, but I've been doing networking for 12 years, and I just got into it back like maybe 3 years ago. So for a lot of people, it will be a paradigm shift for actually start doing that.
Yeah, so I come from the other side, sort of systems into networking, and it's great now that with networking I can use my regular DevOps sort of tools, and so you can, once you've got your network defined in GitHub, you can use like code review software to get people to review your network diffs and stuff like that. So
yeah, cool. There's so many APIs currently in development, so you can not only use Ansible. I think it's all, it is no one recipe. You can't really just do one thing, right? You can't just use Ansible and everything covers everything. No, it won't be possible. So what you need to do, you use your Ansible to make the config consistent. So you have your config consistency stuff, and if you deploy something, that's fine. But then you have a separate stuff which you checking, doing automatic remediation, or maybe not so much automatic remediation, but you can actually go in, perform some checks, and that's a separate piece of software. Maybe you do some linting as well. So, but that's going to be a separate software which you can run in parallel. As well as I think the model of Ansible and how you interact with the devices doesn't really scale. So you can, if there is a 12. Well, in my team, there's 9 people, right? If those people start to, every single one of them start writing Python scripts, and they start executing those scripts on all these devices at the same time, that's not going to go well. So you need to think about how you're going to scale that. You're probably going to want to have some kind of universal API to your network. The companies like TailF and Glueware maybe, because it's really hard to understand what they do, but people told me that that's what they do. They will provide you that universal one point where you interact with the whole network. So you specify the host, you specify what to do with that, and it's going to do it for you. You can probably write your own, and I don't think it's hard. So something which is like a middleware, which sits between your network and the network and your scripts, and it acts as a, so only that thing connects to the devices, and you interact with that. So you push config to it, but you don't SSH into devices directly. So that's, I think, how you would approach that. Any other questions?
It kind of brings into question the whole, what do you use as a repository for your hosts? We have hosts in Kempty and a list of hosts in Nagios and a list of hosts in Ansible. And
For those at home, there's a whole mash of stuff of hosts. What do you use?
So you probably, there are actual couple open source projects with Ansible, so you can use someone wrote that, so it uses as a backend database, it uses Mongo or uses MySQL. So I'm currently using MySQL, and there's an inventory database. So there are some other things like discovery software, which goes and discovers the network and puts information into the database. There is another thing which is which connects to the database, outputs when you run Ansible. Automatically, Ansible will run the other script. There's an option in there, so you can run another script which picks up data from the what runs that script, which takes information from the database and gives it to Ansible, and that's how it runs. So you probably, if you have, I would say, if you have more than 10 devices, you probably should start thinking about doing that, because it's going to grow, and especially if you want to manage CPs with that, like a customer stuff. So you're probably going to think about that, how to do it, because files don't scale. You're going to end up with, every host has a file, every group has a file, 1,000 hosts, 1,000 groups. It's unmanageable, even if you're using Git. If you're using Git for your repository, for your Ansible repository. Right.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right.